Good game.
Okay, it's backwards compatible time, Jung, but we've got just one problem.
I know, Badge. So much stuff happened in the games industry in the 90s, it's gonna be impossible to cover it all.
True, but we do have to try, so let's kick it off with 1990. In the two preceding decades, we'd seen the birth, boom, and then the bust of the video games industry. But by 1990, gaming was back in the black and bigger than ever before.
And it didn't get any better than the biggest game release of 1990, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. The third outing for Nintendo's dungaree-wearing plumber took him back to the Mushroom Kingdom, but this time there were more levels to conquer, more costumes to collect, and more Koopas to crush, and it was brilliant.
For its time, Mario 3 was one of the highest-selling games of all time, and for 8-bit Mario thrills, you still can't beat it.
Speaking of beat it, do you remember the last time Michael Jackson was cool?
I do, Jung. It was the 90s, and in 1990, he had two of the smoothest video games of the decade to his name, both called Moonwalker. While the two versions were very different, they both saw you controlling the gloved one as he danced his way through levels based on many of his best-known film clips, with your aim being to rescue a number of impressionable young children.
Moonwalker came out both in the arcades and on this thing. It's the Sega Mega Drive, and although it had been around for a while in its native Japan, it would take until 1990 for it to hit the rest of the world. You had one of these, didn't you, Bet?
I did, Jung. In fact, in the early to mid-90s, you were one of two things. You were either a Sega man or a Nintendo man, and I was a Sega man. The Mega Drive started out with a lot of old arcade ports like Altered Beast. But it quickly built itself a game library packed full of awesomeness, including a few of my personal favourites like Echo the Dolphin, Another World, and Virtual Racing.
As good a start as 1990 was, things got even better in 1991. Capcom's Street Fighter II came out in the arcades, sparking a coin-operated quarter-circle kicking craze that took every milk bar in the world by storm.
Sid Meier's Civilization series also began its long history in 1991, introducing the world to the empire-building strategy that still dominates the genre today. But what 1991 will really be remembered for is the beginning of gaming's highest-profile feud, an epic rivalry, the likes of which may never be seen again in the pages of gaming history, a gargantuan grudge match that still burns white-hot to this very day and will never, ever, ever end.
Mario vs. Sonic, right? That's right, both the first Sonic the Hedgehog game and the next Mario game, Super Mario World, released within a couple months of each other in 1991, sparking off a mascot battle that helped to further fuel the most brutal console war the games industry has ever seen.
But whichever side you chose, you were getting a great game. Sonic was lightning fast, and it shot by in a blur before your brain had time to compute how much fun you were having. And it also had one of the best game soundtracks ever, which we still can't get out of our heads all these years later.
Meanwhile, Super Mario World was the launch title for the brand new Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which finally made it out of Japan just in time for 1991. Mario World had a slower, more deliberate pace, with an emphasis on conquering an entire island and unlocking all of its many secrets using a variety of super suits and a little dinosaur called Yoshi.
Over the next couple of years, even more great games came out. The fatalities flew thick and fast when the first Mortal Kombat came out in '92. The real-time strategy genre was birthed when Westwood Studios released Dune 2: The Battle for Arrakis. And the Nazis got a much-deserved taste of chain gun when id Software's groundbreaking Wolfenstein 3D introduced the world to first-person shooters.
In 1993, the next big thing from id Software would change the face of PC gaming forever. It was dark, slightly scary, and exhilarating to play. It was Doom. As a space marine stranded on a demon-infested Martian base, you had to wade through countless zombies, mutant freaks, and whatever the hell this thing is, to eventually get to hell itself to take on the all-powerful Cyber Demon. Doom literally changed the way games were made in the 90s. It introduced the world to deathmatch, and it kicked off a first-person shooting boom that is still riding high today. However, one thing from 1993 that didn't catch on was this. It's called a 3DO, and it was manufactured by a variety of companies, including Panasonic and Sanyo. This one here was made by a company called Goldstar, and although the 3DO was hyped up to be the future of gaming, it really wasn't.
It was the games, wasn't it, John? The 3DO just didn't have them, and the ones it did have were really bad, like this one.
Ah, another visitor. Don't be afraid. Be terrified!
Which is probably one of the worst first-person shooters ever.
Thankfully, throughout the middle of the 90s, literally hundreds of good games were released.
Nintendo created one of the all-time best 2D platform adventure games with Super Metroid.
Blizzard Entertainment released the first Warcraft game, Orcs and Humans.
Earthworm Jim became a popular game character for all of about 20 minutes.
Squaresoft's Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI made a big splash in every part of the world, except Australia, since they were never released here.
Peter Molyneux took the God game to the Funhouse with Theme Park, and just way too many more to mention.
By 1995, the game was changing. Sega released their Saturn console early in the year, and the Sony PlayStation also made its debut.
Now, these two machines alone signify the greatest technological leap in home consoles.
They used CDs instead of cartridges, which not only gave developers a huge amount of space to work with, but it also slashed the production costs of making games.
And not only that, but these were the first consoles that were really designed from the start to specialize in 3D graphics, and as a result, games as we know it literally took on a whole new dimension.
The Saturn had games like Yu Suzuki's super technical 3D brawler, Virtua Fighter 2. As well as Nights into Dreams, a magical action game that took you into an imaginary world of dreams and nightmares.
Meanwhile, the PlayStation had the likes of button-mashing punch-fest Tekken, the techno-pumping futuristic hover racing of Wipeout, and the marsupial-themed platforming of Crash Bandicoot, and plenty more besides.
Unfortunately for the Saturn, the PlayStation was a fair bit more powerful, had far classier games, and most importantly had a way better marketing department, all things that contributed to the Saturn's untimely demise in 1998. Meanwhile, the PS1 thrived well into the next decade.
The other big console release for the mid-90s was this. It's the Nintendo 64.
Now, I played this bad boy more than anything else during the 90s. The N64 was more powerful and prettier than any of the other consoles, and it definitely had some jaw-droppingly classic games, like the bear and bird platforming antics of Banjo-Kazooie, the suave super spy shenanigans of James Bond in GoldenEye 007.
Super Mario 64, of course, which many people still believe to be the best console game ever made.
Here we go!
Let's not forget my favorite game ever, Banjo, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
The late 90s saw a massive explosion of brilliant and groundbreaking games.
In '96, the first graphical, massively multiplayer online game, Meridian 59.
As we heard earlier in the show, id Software's Quake brought online multiplayer to the masses by being the first game to include internet death matches right out of the box.
Resident Evil made us pee in our pants with a combination of fear and zombie love.
And the first Tomb Raider game inflated the profile of gaming heroines to ridiculous proportions.
By the end of the 90s, we'd played Half-Life and Counter-Strike, Diablo, StarCraft, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Soul Calibur, Planescape Torment, and just so many more. In fact, Banjo, I'm gonna make a big call here and say that the 90s is my favorite decade for gaming ever.
Well, this decade's not quite over yet, but I do have to agree with you, Jung. We've mentioned so many great games today, and we've still only scratched the surface, and I think that really says something about how good it was to be a gamer in the 90s.
So